Yeah, absolutely. And I actually wasn't aware of this myself, but the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, AA was being founded, in the early part of the 20th century, right around the 30s, and that was the time when LSD was discovered, and it was soon to be this golden age, so-called, of psychedelic research and lots of very fascinating explorations. Also, at a time when the mental health institutionalization of serious mental illness was really hard. It was really challenging. There was this kind of clash between neurosurgery and pharmacotherapy. So LSD arrived at this very influential time. So Bill Wilson, AA was founded, I believe, in 1938. The Big Book was written. The model succeeded in its expansion and growth, and there was chapters and a growing membership for the next 15, 20 years. And all the while, Bill Wilson was struggling with all sorts of different behavioral vices. He was addicted to cigarettes. He was known to be a philanderer, and he was deeply depressed and was not able to really achieve success with depression. So because he was a very prolific communicator with all sorts of interesting people at the time, a friend of his, a philosopher, Gerald Hurd, was involved in the early days of the 1950s kind of exploration of LSD. So Hurd recommended, and there's this great book by Don Lattin called Distilled Spirits, where he really goes into a lot of the history here. So Bill Wilson, already sober, already successful in growing the AA fellowship, found LSD as an option for the treatment of his depression. And there's a very fascinating correlate around the time that he was receiving his treatments. I believe it was around the LA area. The magazine for AA, known as the Grapevine, was a very popular media magazine for people interested in the topic. And he just happened to cling upon this idea of what he called emotional sobriety as being the next frontier of what it truly means to recover. Once you've put the booze down, once you've gotten a handle on life without substances, what is it really that needs to be worked on? And it just so happened that around that time he was receiving his LSD treatments. So when I was coming out of my Ibogaine treatment in 2011, I had gone the traditional 12-step route. I had been arrested with a felony charge and a lawyer that I was fortunate my parents were able to afford hiring to keep me out of trouble. So the only way I'm going to get you off the hook is if you go to rehab, do a halfway house, do the 12 steps, get a sponsor, do an IOP, all of the stuff, the traditional kind of path. And it just didn't work. Relapsing for another 10 months, I went to an Ibogaine clinic and then immersed myself into the 12-step recovery. And I kind of found right off the bat that nobody really knew about this history with Bill Wilson. Maybe some people were knowledgeable about MAPS and all of the work of the so-called psychedelic renaissance, but the reactions that I would get if I ever tried to talk about my Ibogaine treatment were not very encouraging. So I just kind of started to censor myself. But it was years later that I was like, if this is an idea from way back when in Bill Wilson's time, and even if it's a history that AA is not happy to widely publicize, clearly this idea has been around the ether for a very long time. So it's probably not going to be terribly hard to find other people. And so the history, you could even see there's an article, I believe, in the MAPS bulletin in the 90s by Ralph Metzner that talks about the synergy of 12 steps and work around ayahuasca based healing. I saw an article, I believe it's by Myron Stolaroff, about a talk that he was invited to give at a spiritual retreat for AA in Redwood National Park. So there's been this like weird connection between the psychedelic world and 12 steppers for a very long time. Yeah, I mean the it's interesting that Bill Wilson took LSD prior to Tim Leary, right? And a lot of work was going on, but after the cultural times of the upheaval around the Vietnam War and all the backlash of the Richard Nixon war on drugs, LSD and other psychedelics was becoming too much of a political hot potato. And so Bill Wilson, interestingly, I feel like Bill Wilson had some of the most hopeful outlooks on LSD because at the time there was this idea of, rock bottom. and alcoholics who were just not able to get their lives together and admit that they had a problem. The concept of rock bottom felt like that would produce some kind of gift of desperation, as they call it. But rather than that, Bill Wilson had this idea that, a really struggling, severe alcoholic, not able to understand the concepts of a higher power or why they would try to do well by their fellow man through sponsorship or service to the community or anything like that. Bill Wilson thought that by providing someone like that with an LSD experience, having a peak mystical type of moment, kind of like his white light encounter in Towns Hospital, while he was getting, among other things, the belladonna treatment, he thought that it could maybe offer like a preview into what a spiritual awakening could look like from a thorough application of the 12 steps. But the history here gets pretty contentious, and AA likes to kind of keep it under wraps. But there was a big reason why Bill Wilson was ultimately kind of taken out of high level leadership positions because of his advocacy for LSD, and they essentially muzzled him by saying, please do not talk about this as somebody who has as much notoriety as you do on the public arena. Alienating. I wouldn't necessarily say I would lie. I'd kind of lie by omission, right? If I was asked to give the lead share at the beginning of a meeting during a speaker meeting, I just kind of wouldn't want to get pulled into some conversation that didn't feel authentic. So when I first got to South Florida after my Ibogaine treatment, the small talk was like, "What treatment center did you go to? What was your drug of choice?" And I would like mention I went to Mexico, and that would pique a lot of interest. And I would talk about this drug that I took called Ibogaine, and it was kind of just like, "Oh, I'd love to try that." And I was having a hard time feeling that the kind of sacredness, the profundity of the transformative nature of that experience, that quite frankly, before I took Ibogaine, I was completely disinterested in 12 step and embracing it like at the rehab the year before. I knew I had a problem. I knew I had to do something about it, but I didn't really want to embrace this lifestyle of abstinence. And I kind of still tried to wiggle out of it immediately after my detox, but thankfully I kind of came to my senses. And so the open-mindedness that allowed me to just kind of say, look, if I commit the next 7 months of my life to going to NA meetings, working with a sponsor, having some crappy restaurant job, so be it, right? Like this is going to be something that I've become grateful for. But thankfully I had a private therapist that was knowledgeable about Ibogaine that I could talk to him about. I had some close friends that I could share my interest in psychedelics with, but ultimately I was kind of able to completely separate it and allow myself to fully like embrace the program and work the steps and do that kind of thing. But yeah, along the way, there were other elements of things that kind of started to bother me, like NA's opposition to harm reduction, or this idea that somebody who seems like they might be able to have success, not necessarily treading a path of total abstinence, but could maybe be pursuing some type of moderate consumption, ought to be supported. And even, our national health agencies in the United States define recovery as kind of in a very close way to harm reduction. It's really the pursuit of any positive change, however incremental. So it's all kinds of things like that we've tried to piece together in PIR.